Jump the median and hit her head on.
She's gone.
No, she's going to be a long recovery, but
That's
yeah.
awful. Oh boy. Well, on that note, we're going to call to order the Common Council Ordinance Committee regular meeting. Today is April 18th, 2023. It is 7:02. And I'll just call the roll that I see here. We've got Ed Camacho, Tom Livingston, David Hoovelman, Nora Nojewski-Eitner, and Josh Goldstein. Oh, there's Nora. And I am Lisa Shanahan, the chair. So that's who's here today. We have a public hearing to discuss and vote on Chapter 73, Article 1, Oak Hills Park Authority. So, Brian, do you see anybody here to speak on that matter?
Okay, hold on. Participants. We have one participant, Anthony Carano. Anthony, if you'd like to speak on the matter that's up for public hearing, just raise your hand. Otherwise, you can certainly speak again when we get to the public comment section for the non-public hearing. Okay, so we have one attendee. Mr. Carano has not raised his hand, so I did not receive any emails in advance concerning this particular matter.
That was my next question. So hearing no public comment, I will close the public hearing. So then we can now discuss and vote Chapter 73, Article 1, Oak Hills Park Authority. Mr. Livingston took the laboring oar on this one. Essentially, what we're doing is adding the Director of Recreations and Parks as a authority member. Anything else we ought to mention on that, Tom, before we?
Well, we just took out the requirement that the notice be given in by newspaper. Still have to give notice. It's just not by newspaper.
And that's another important matter. Yes. Saves everybody some money.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, committee? Any comments before we take a vote on the ordinance being sent on to the Common Council?
Yeah, I'll make that motion. Oh, David.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Well, I was going to make the motion, so sorry.
So make the motion and then Mr. Camacho can have his comment during discussion.
So I move the item. I do have one question, or not really a question, just a comment. Is it already to make it now?
Yep, and then we'll go to Ed. Sure.
Yeah, I just think this is a good move. It's good because it's a city asset, and I think that a representative of Recs and Parks should definitely be a part of the decision making over there. So that's my only comment.
Thank you. Ed, you had a question?
Yeah. On 73.2, I guess that's the only change in the whole thing. But are the terms, it seems that the terms are not staggered, right? Because the terms were 3 years and they're all sort of from the anniversary of the ordinance creating the authority, right? So the terms are not staggered.
Not anymore, because I think that they're already staggered by, this is the authority's been in place for more than a decade, right, Tom?
Yeah.
So that's staggered by virtue of just time and
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
and the odds. Okay. So with respect to no member shall serve more than 2 terms, and then basically skip a turn, and then I guess they can come back. Might it not be a good idea to make an exception except by a 2/3 vote of the Common Council if there's, for whatever reason, there's a good enough reason to appoint someone to a 3rd term without having to go through the 2-year hiatus?
I have two comments on that. One, would that require us to go back to another public hearing, Brian?
It would
And
feel
2,
substantive.
that would be a change in the current ordinance, obviously. Nobody's ever mentioned that to me. I know there've been some people who have been on it, who've been off and then gone back on it, like you say.
If it's going to have to go back to for a public hearing, then it's not important enough to take that kind of time. So
I think it would have to go back to a public hearing.
Yeah, my thought would be this is not. It's in my opinion, it's not a significant change, but it's significant enough that it would require another public hearing.
I think
Okay.
that the authority would want to have, say about it. So I think it would absolutely have to go back.
I mean, the authority at this point, there is no term limit, right? There are no term limits, right, at present.
No, there is. No
Oh,
member shall serve more than 2 consecutive terms,
Yeah,
right?
that's what you're
That already
saying, Ed.
exists.
But is that as presently amended, or?
Yeah.
Yes,
We didn't change that.
But I'm saying there were no prior term limits, right?
there was.
We haven't changed that, Ed, at all.
No,
So just so everyone can hear this. Currently in chapter 73-2A, the last full sentence, no member shall serve more than 2 consecutive terms, and after serving on the authority for 2 consecutive terms, no member shall be reappointed to the authority for at least 2 years.
all right, so that was pre-existing, okay,
Yes.
Yeah. so let's take this one. It's not big, yeah,
So are you okay with it as stated?
sure, yeah.
Okay, great. Any other comments from any other committee member? All right, so hearing none, all in favor?
Lisa, real quick,
sorry.
on 73-2A, the 9th member shall be the director of recreation and parks for the city of Norwalk. It looks like there are blue, we just want comma or their designee.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for catching that. I
Yep.
thought,
It might be deleted. It looks like it is, but we need a comma.
yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. All right, with that change being made, all in favor of moving this item to common council for approval?
Aye,
Great. That's unanimous. So thank you. That piece of business is done. Now we're going to open up the public hearing, the section for public comment. So maybe Mr. Carano has something to speak
Let
about.
me take a look and see if Mr. Carano wants to speak, 1, and 2, whether anyone else, because it looks like I don't know if there's more participants. I see Jessica and Darlene Young. So since we started our meeting, Sabrina Godesky and Jessica Vonacek and Darlene Young, Common Council member, have also appeared. We have 2 attendees. We also have Nicole Eady and Anthony Carano, and I didn't know if either one of them wanted to speak. If you do, on one of the items that's on the agenda, please raise your hand and we will give you the floor for 3 minutes. Okay, so nobody raised their hand.
Okay. So we'll close public comment and we'll move on to the acceptance of the minutes. Do I have a motion to accept the minutes of March 21st, 2023? Mr. Livingston, does anybody have any adjustments to the minutes as they appear? I know Mr. Livingston and I shared a couple of typos, which we won't take people's time with right now. Nothing substantive. Any other thoughts? Concerns? Hearing none, accepting the minutes as filed, a vote on that. Everybody in favor of accepting the minutes is filed. There's 4 of us.
yes, I.
Oh, okay, there's 5 of us. Nora, I'm expecting that you are abstaining.
Abstaining, yes, thank you.
Okay, good. So we've got the minutes taken care of. So now old business, we're going to move to discuss and vote on the Arts and Cultural District proposal. Approval process and ordinance, chapter 17A Arts Commission is how it is named. And I just have to say that we started out with so many pieces of this, and Tom Livingston, I don't know how he did it. He just put it in like a condenser and put it all together and it came out beautifully. So thank you so much, Tom. That was really a hard press, but it's in good shape now, we think. So we would, I guess, well, we can vote about it later, but does anybody have any comments that they'd like to share right now with us about the new Arts and Cultural Commission ordinance? There's a couple little typos that we know about that we can fix, but Nora, we'll start with you. You've got your hand up.
I may have just been flagging one of the typos, 17A6B.
A6B.
Do we need this?
Brian?
What's that?
What- Yeah, do we need this? Needs to come out. Yep. I was saying before that I made it so it wasn't yellow anymore, but I forgot to delete it. 100%.
I removed that. Is there something else in that paragraph, Nora, or was it just that?
Nope, that was the That was
Okay.
the one that I had.
And by the way, we decided we needed it. We decided that it was important to have, is that the guidelines part? Yeah, we want to have
Yes.
guidelines approved by Common Council. So
No, I thoroughly support having guidelines and having them be approved, so I was all for removing the do need this and not for removing this.
yeah, without the need for guidelines, exactly. And just found a typo in 17A-2 definition. In the third line, it says a map of each cultural district as so designated instead of districts. So we get rid of that S. Tom, do you want to kind of give an overview of, how we put it together? Mostly what we worked on was getting the account language where we thought it needed to be.
Sure. So we had the language from last time, and we went back and tried to incorporate the state guidelines and make sure we tracked that more specifically in terms of language and the guidelines, but also removed some of the either redundant or unnecessary language that we had a long list of purposes you guys may remember last time, or not purposes, I think powers. And we took out some of the stuff that was already in the purpose, and then we consolidated the other ones to try and track the state standards. And then we also tailored the account itself a little bit. And I'm going to point out a couple things here. So you get the powers and duties, and you get we added a section on acceptance of public art. And that 17A6. But the account, what we did, so what happens, we were thinking about what type of funds we were going to get and how, how should they be restricted, so to speak. So you have in 17A7, you have 17A7A1, you have funds for sponsorships and underwriting of specific events and programming within a district. Remember, this is for those money that goes for a specific activity in the district. So they're going to be, in order to spend that stuff, that money, they have to be approved in accordance with city and common council policy and procedure, which means if the ordinary approval process requires approval, it has to go through that. But we put on an exception in here for individual sponsorship or underwriting that doesn't exceed $20,000, just so that they can approve some of the smaller things without having to go through several months approval. And then the second item, number 2, was that somebody may designate funds without any real programming behind it, but they just want to put money in to be used for the district. So that's the second category of funds received in this account. And then the third one is just investment income. And then you go down to the expenditure 17A8. Then the first one is any funds held under 7A1. Now those are the underwriting and sponsorship funds. Those have to be expended in accordance with those sponsorships and underwriting. So somebody can give money, but you have to use it for that purpose. The second category, which is the other items, money that's just been given to the account for the district, that has to be expended in accordance with the arts and cultural plan, which the commission has to come up with, and any other guidelines prepared by business development, tourism department, and approved by the common council, right? So that's really to control how that money is spent. And the other stuff is pretty much it was in the last, I think pretty much the same, maybe in a different space and different wording, but the same as when last draft in the last meeting.
Well,
Lisa?
the one new thing I think we did was the acceptance of public art.
Oh,
Because
right, yeah, sorry, yeah.
yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that because I also sit on Rex and Park, and we know about the ballerina, and that was, a little bit controversial. So what we decided to do about that is first we defined it. Well, actually not first, last we defined it, but we were of the mind that there's different places where these artworks go. They could go to school, they could go at City Hall, they could go on a Rec and Park property. And so what we really wanted to do was put the city in a position of making a flow chart for each of these, have them first come to this commission and say, is this something really that we should care about? We should think is worthy for this. And then it should go to whichever city department who should then decide whether or not that piece of property, that piece of art should go to their property and what those guidelines are. And so Rec and Parks has created the guidelines for itself about how it will accept these types of things. And we would assume that Alan Lowe will have his set of rules. The city schools might have their set of rules. So we did add that. So we can go back on that in a minute. Looks like Josh has a question, then David, and then Jess can weigh in.
I didn't know if Jess was weighing in on something you were saying right now. So I don't know if Jess was.
Are you, Jess? Do you want to correct me?
No, something that Tom was summarizing, so that's fine. I'm more than happy to let the council go first.
No, go for it.
Yeah, you might.
I may actually have a question that might pertain to this. But I've got a couple of them. I don't know if you want to do them in order or you want me. Since we're talking about the guidelines,
Yeah.
we haven't approved other guidelines before. That's a question.
No, we did for the dining. We did approve. Didn't we
We
approve
didn't approve the guidelines.
We didn't approve the
We haven't
guidelines.
yet?
We
No.
approved the formation of guidelines.
Right.
Are we?
And
The guidelines are administrative documents that get updated by the administration from time to time.
They were not approved by this committee. I mean, they were drafted and revised and edited and by a lot of different hands. But they were not approved.
Huh, I thought we said that we had to approve them for dining guidelines. Huh, shame on us.
Well, I guess the question is, what do we want?
Yeah. I mean,
And
it
that
is-
was, yeah, that was related to the question that I had, because I know that for the other, and it will pertain to your next item as well on the agenda, but for outdoor dining, we did not approve the guidelines. We worked with you to bring the ordinance and the guidelines through. And we can do the same here. We actually have the guidelines drafted, so we can do the same here. But for consistency purposes, I was going to bring that up from just a standard of, I think the thought was that with outdoor dining, just as a reminder that we wanted to be nimble with the guidelines and standards, and that if we were to provide guidelines, that we would have a little bit more flexibility to be responsive to the market and responsive to things that we were seeing throughout the outdoor dining season, versus being embedded in the ordinance where we had more of a process to be able to take it through, to be able to make a change.
Jess, I also think that when we did cannabis and we did guidelines for the cannabis fund, I don't think we made those subject to common council approval either.
Good point.
Pretty sure.
Yeah. You might be, you were probably.
I thought, okay, that could be the case. I can go back.
We could-
We don't need to do it. So. The one question is, obviously the question is, do we want it? I mean, how often are these going to be changed in terms of guidelines for, say, acceptance of public art? I can go either way.
Me too. How does the council feel about it? The committee?
So I just raised my hand to say, I had said, I think it actually is a good idea. I totally recognize that normally guidelines don't go to the council for all the reasons about flexibility, et cetera. But this is not an instance where I think flexibility is really going to be a primary issue, right? It isn't unlikely to change often, and it is a budgetary issue. I mean, that would be the reason that it should have, council oversight, right? When you take on a piece of public art, you are, committing in perpetuity to maintenance costs. And so I feel like this actually falls in a very different category than something like the dining ordinance or cannabis, where flexibility is a desirable trait. Here, I think council oversight as to what kind of budgetary expectations we want to have, how do we want to, account for the potential future costs of this, would make much more sense for our review. So just my two cents.
I think Nora makes a good point. I also just want to amend myself, because I just took a look at the cannabis rule. The language we used was, the guidelines shall be approved by the common council from time to time, and in any event, no less frequently than once every 24 months.
Correct.
Right.
It's
Okay,
section.
good. We didn't
it's-
lose our minds, Tom. It did happen.
No, I was thinking about, and Josh, it does say that you can't, and nothing can be done until they're approved initially, right?
No application, that's correct. No
Right,
application.
so yeah,
shall be
I knew we had them
accepted,
there.
or designated for particular use until the guidelines have been approved by the common council and published on the city's website.
Right. So I knew we did have at least, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, that's
if
correct.
you-
I was wrong.
That was the-
I was wrong.
But the thing about guidelines is that they exist on the sidebar, right? So they don't have to come up every single time. You just use the guidelines as a guide.
Well, there
The
are two
gui- the
sets of guidelines here.
the guidelines can be, I mean, even if they have to come up every 24 months, they don't have to be changed. You can just say the way it's going is fine, and you can just
That's
approve them
correct.
again as is.
Well, this
Um,
one doesn't have that, I don't think, the 24.
No, it doesn't. The
No, it
language
doesn't
is
have
in
that
1-9, which I can provide to people. If it's something, if that's language that you want, we can look at the cannabis ordinance to put something in like that. If it's something different and you don't want it, then we can leave it as is. It's really up to the committee as to what you want.
And you would just bring the guidelines as you make changes, like if there's going to be a big.
Yeah. Yeah. Just so you know, there are two places guidelines you use this. One is in
Public art 17A.
public art guidelines, and there's also 17A8, I believe,
Yes,
which is
expenditures.
expenditures.
Yeah.
So that, that one, I kind of well, I wrote this part, so I kind of think that have it, but I don't feel that strongly about it.
Can I just jump in really quickly? So any piece that we're going to get donated to the city, the mayor's gonna have to execute a contract, so it's gonna have to come through council regardless.
It's just, we're talking about the guidelines, whether we, have the guidelines approved. It's not. we know
Yeah, but
art will
to-
come through, yeah.
To Nora's point, she was like, if we're taking on a piece, if there's maintenance associated, there's budgetary costs associated, which is 100% true. But for any donation that's a physical donation, it will have to come to Common Council via the charter, not via the guidelines, regardless of what the guidelines say or do. But the guidelines that we drafted at this point, they mainly delineate the process in which we do that. Versus if we do or don't have to bring it, they always have to come to council at some point in time.
Thank you for that clarification.
Whatever we
Can
do, I feel that we should be consistent. So if we're gonna begin a cadence of, reviewing guidelines every 24 months, we should make sure that we're doing that consistently. That's been something that we've talked about in this committee, is the consistency across the different ordinances with the different commissions and the boards. And so that there's a consistent cadence of what we do. So if we review guidelines, we should be reviewing them consistently for each one. That's my opinion.
No, I think, I'm sorry, I don't know if we're in order or out of order anymore.
Yeah, I know.
But just two things. I'll bring up Mike, if you don't mind. And I think I want to just a clarification for Sabrina, just to make sure. If I remember correctly, with the ballerina piece, the thing that came before council, I don't think was the annual maintenance costs. I think what came before council was an acknowledgement of the acceptance of the gift itself, of the donation. I don't remember if the other thing that council approved were like annual costs associated with it. That I don't remember. I could be wrong, but I don't know. The question I had for Tom and Lisa was, I realized that we define a cultural district, but we don't actually, I don't think we say what our cultural district is. And I know that we've talked about not doing the whole city and so on and so forth, but if we set this all up and we don't have a cultural district, an actual cultural district that's approved by the Common Council, I'm wondering, how are we supposed to do that? Is that another ordinance? Because it says pretty clearly here that a cultural arts district is an area within the city of Norwalk designated by the Common Council from time to time as a cultural district. So I'm wondering, how do we do that?
I think it goes through the planning committee, right? Jess, do you want to talk to that, how you imagine that was going to work?
Yeah, so thanks, Lisa. So the way in which we did the enterprise zone is that we took the ordinance through you, but we actually brought the geography through the Economic and Community Development Committee. So we had presented the Arts and Cultural District to them as an introductory committee meeting before we had come to you at the Ordinance Committee. And that proposed arts and cultural district, which they have not yet voted on, but that district overlaid with the enterprise zone, which also overlays with the opportunity zone, which is the whole urban core, including South Norwalk, in addition to Wall Street, West Avenue. And we also talked, I believe, at the ordinance meeting the last time we met, about the different districts and how the districts were delineated by walking zones, and how we may potentially want to create other cultural districts like around Gallagher Mansion, for example, and around other places in Norwalk. And to be able to do that, we would be able to do that. But those maps would then be, the cultural districts would then be approved through the Economic Community Development Committee, much like that enterprise zone map was approved.
And then it goes to common council for a vote, and then it's subject to this ordinance. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay, so so it's not an ordinance itself that comes through planning and development,
Right.
ECD. That's not how we do it. We do it by essentially a motion, or an item that gets
Yeah.
approved by planning. Yeah.
That's
Essentially.
correct.
Okay.
Yes, that's
Okay.
that's the way in which the enterprise zone was passed. And so again, for those consistency
consistency.
purposes, when we were talking about the arts and cultural district, we were saying for consistency, let's do it the same as the enterprise zone, just to be sure that we're following that same process.
Great. Thank you, Jess.
And then it's subject. Did you have another question, Josh, before we move on?
No, that was it.
Okay, cool. David and then Nora.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. Couple of questions. Is this council voting, is that coming through a committee? Is this going to come through Recreation, Parks and Cultural Affairs, or is this going to go directly to the council? So things like money acceptance or an expenditure or any of these things, does this have to go through a specific committee of the council that oversees the board or commission?
Where are you, David?
Well, when you talk about in here, approved in accordance with city and common council policy and procedures, you know, are there votes that need to be taken? And if the votes are taken by the council, do they come through a committee first before they go to the council? Or does this board and commission present directly to the council?
Well,
So the way, oh, sorry. I'm sorry,
you
Tom.
can say nothing goes directly to the council. So we always act through committees, right? So, I mean, you can always designate a committee it goes to first, although we could do that. But the reason I said it's by a policy, you know, in accordance with standards and practices, and I'm from the language in front of me, was whatever we do for other things, we should follow the same rules. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean,
And I
Well,
think
what do we do for other things then, I guess is the question. It's not clear to me that, let's use the acceptance of a piece of art that's worth more than $20,000 and has to be voted on.
right.
Right, so
I
in
is
that,
these funds,
in that
aren't these funds designated, Jess? I mean, these funds and sponsorships, they're designated to a specific purpose.
they will be,
right.
in some cases, they will be. So for example, I'll use the Dancing Girl as an example, right? So that was a public piece of property, right? That is managed by Parks and Rec, and that Parks and Rec would be in a position to have to maintain the park around that particular structure. So when we accepted the Dancing Girl, we took it to the Parks and Rec committee, because we knew that that sculpture was going on public property that was managed by Parks and Rec / DPW. I think that if we were going to take a monetary or a sponsorship or some sort of donation that in another form, we could potentially take it through economic community development, or in addition, we could take it through finance. Now in finance, I don't think that we would need to take it through finance because it's not a general fund, because this ordinance would set up a special account that we would be making the deposit into the special account. So in my mind, we usually takes the Arts Commission's items through economic community development or through Parks and Rec. We've done it more through Parks and Rec just because the destination of those pieces have been public property.
We're talking more about
Correct me if I'm
funds though,
wrong.
right, David? You're more focused on the funds because we have,
I'm focused on all
No.
of it from the standpoint of, isn't the committee is Recreation, Parks and Cultural Affairs?
That's
correct?
correct. That's correct.
So isn't that the logical designee then?
Well, and that's what we have done in the past is take it through that particular committee because it's always fit well. So we could
Okay,
potentially
But then my
designate.
question is, shouldn't that be designated within the ordinance, that
Well,
that's
so-
the funnel
so-
up through to the council?
David, if I could, just, that's fine. I think the reason I had the language like this is to give flexibility depending on what it is. I mean, when you look at common council, two things, there's city and common council policy and procedures. In terms of city, we're thinking about things like what the charter requires. What type of approval process might be in our charter, what might be in the financial policies of the city. That's on that side. On the common council policy, if it is the council policy that this acceptance of gifts should go through Parks and Recs, great. If it's the policy that the designation of cultural district goes through ECD, fine. That's the reason the language is written the way it is to give flexibility. That said, if the committee wants to do, or the one committee, that's fine too. But again, it was written this way to give flexibility to the council to decide how it wants to act.
Okay.
Can
fine.
I make one
go ahead.
additional comment? Sorry, guys, that I'm weighing in so much. From an operations standpoint, the flexibility is very helpful because these committees only meet once a month. So for example, if someone wants to give money to the holiday celebration that happens in Sono in front of 50 Washington, and they decide that they only want their funding to go to that event, and they decide 10 days that they're before that event that they're going to give us funding towards that, and we don't have a committee until 10 days after the holiday event happens, then we don't have a mechanism for actually being able to take in the funds or be able to seek the approval. So if we have flexibility, then from a staffing operations standpoint, we could potentially take it through finance or economic community development or Parks and Rec, arts and culture, or one of the other committees. So that actually gives us a lot of flexibility where we wouldn't want to say we can't actually take your funds for the event because we can't fit it into the calendar.
And the tipping point's $20,000, correct? Up to that point, you don't have to bring this through committee.
Correct.
Okay, that's fine. It was just a question that I'm asking about, operationally, policy-wise, definitionally, that we're clear on that. I had one other.
That's a good discussion. Thank you for bringing it through.
I have one other question, and this is when we're talking about terms and assignment of people and missing 3 meetings. That's a new thing for us to put into an ordinance on a board and commission. I happen to like it. Is that a cadence that we want to pick up moving forward in other commissions? Is that something new, Tom?
It is new. Jess recommended it. I should note that that's one of the things we're looking at for the charter revision as well. Not necessarily this language, but a procedure to remove members, because we do have a number of situations where people don't show up to meetings.
I applaud it, and thank you guys for thinking in those terms. And I think that we need to look seriously at that, because we do have some boards and commissions that have fallen by the wayside because of lack of participation. And I appreciate you guys thinking about that here and moving forward. So that's
There's
Just
definitely
thought about it. Yeah. Just brought it up, and it's a great idea. So
So thank you. So Nora's had her hand up forever. Thank you, Nora, for being patient.
Oh, no worries. Just a couple of things, which at this point are sort of treading some territory we've already covered, but I do want to loop back to. And I think this, like everything else in our lives right now, overlaps with the charter discussion to a certain extent. But I very much understand Jess's point about flexibility and the value of that, particularly with our sort of rigid, calendar situation. On the flip side, I feel very strongly that overall, one of the reorganizations that needs to happen at the city level is that every board and commission should have a designated council committee to which it reports, because we have a lot of free floaters, right? And it's never clear who they're supposed to report to. And so a lot of the work that they do never really filters into the council, or it filters in random ways. And I think it would, as a general governance matter, we would benefit from each sort of board and commission having a committee that kind of owns it and cares for it and hears from it and connects with it and really brings this work into the larger work of the city. And so I think, that's something to really think about in this instance and going forward. And I've made that recommendation already to the Charter Commission, that they consider putting into the charter requirement that every board and commission be sort of given a home of some sort. Can
I respond to that for a second?
Yeah.
Because I agree. Just two things. One, hopefully the charter language you'll get to see and it'll have that point in it. But for this one, this is a little unique, right? Because you have Sabrina and her department, and Justin's department, business development and tourism, are really monitoring this on the one hand. Yet you have the situation we talked about, like the Parks and Rec and Cultural Affairs on the other, which isn't necessarily involved in some of this day-to-day stuff. Jess, you may want to comment on that. I mean, I hear the point, Nora. I think it's a good point. I struggle with this one.
Yeah, and I should just to point out for everybody's focus, 17A4C says the business development, tourism, other department designated shall provide administrative support. So it does have that tie-in, Nora, that it's at least plugged into a city department that is overseeing it.
Lisa,
Right.
just to jump in real quick, I just want to welcome Nicole Ayers.
Oh, hi,
Common Council
Nicole. Thank you
member,
for joining.
has just dropped in as well. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
no,
and I think, and I totally recognize that, but I also think one of the things we're going to find quite quickly is that a lot of our boards and commissions are interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, or don't fit neatly within our council committees. And in some instances, this may be a longer term push for us to think about whether some of our council committees need to be a little more broadly defined or thought about, in terms of who covers what. And I don't think we need to resolve this necessarily for tonight. So I don't want to, I do get Jess's point about flexibility. And again, this gets into larger questions about the charter having room for flexibility, maybe being a better solution in the long run. The second point I wanted to come back to is this question about the guidelines, and in part because this is going to come up in the affordable housing conversation in just a few minutes. So I do think that it would be helpful for us to, as a committee, start thinking about, because we do want consistency. And I think there are two different kinds of categories of guidelines, or maybe three. I think this is going to be a question we should talk about with the affordable housing too, because affordable housing has the guidelines proposed by this department and then approved by the Affordable Housing Committee, but not by the council. But the council then has to approve the final grants that would be given through the money. So, I feel like there are guidelines that truly are administrative guidelines, and those should be left to the devices of the office. There are guidelines that are setting big policy pictures for the city, and we want the council to approve them, because the whole point is we want to have input as a council before the city departments go to work, right? I take Jess's point that then each individual item comes to the council for approval, but the entire issue is that we want to provide guidance before they start accepting things, right? And so it's extremely important that the council have input into those guidelines before the departments start their work on an individual piece. And maybe part of the issue is that guidelines is maybe we need different terminology. Maybe guidelines means when it's created by the department, it's flexible, it's regulatory, it can be changed by the department at any time as things emerge. Maybe it is, I don't know, what a term of art would be for, but maybe it's, guidance or, policy when it's something that needs council input beforehand. So that again, we're, and then, so I think that those distinctions, that's an important distinction and difference, and we should hang on to our authority when we need to kind of be giving more input going forward. So anyway, I just want to flag that because we're about to talk about it again in 5 minutes. And I'll be interested to get people's thoughts on how we structured it in the affordable housing ordinance and whether we now need to change it, that it should go to the council as well as just the committee or not.
So your view on this would be that the guidelines that we approve for acceptance of public and for expenditures for the cultural district should be approved by common council. Is that?
Well, so that's what I think is interesting. I definitely think the public art ones need to be approved by the council, right? That's a big policy issue. It's going to have consequences. And again, as we said, across multiple departments from multiple pieces of art. And we really want to make some decisions about the big picture before the departments start considering individual issues. I think it's an interesting question. And the question about the guidelines for expenditures is the same question we're going to have with the Affordable Housing Commission. So, do those need to go to the council as a whole, or should they be handled just at the committee or commission level? Because I do think we want some guidance to be given to the departments, right? Before the department's making decisions. That's the whole idea. But do we want the council to weigh in or not? And we might want to. I mean, as you know, I'm a big fan of the council having more opportunities to provide input before processes get rolling. I think that one of the, problems with our charter structure is it just keeps putting us in a position where things don't come to us until the decisions are already made. So I think it potentially might actually be really good for the council to have to review and have oversight over the expenditure guidelines as well. But it should be consistent. If we're going to do it for the Arts Commission, we should do it for the Affordable Housing Trust. We should do a fund. We should do it for the Cannabis Fund. Or it should be at, we just need to do the same thing every time.
Gotcha. David, you got your hand raised, or Tom, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to respond to that if I could. David, I don't know. I don't want to cut you off. I think you.
Go ahead, Tom, respond.
Okay, so no, I think that you're making a good distinction. So let's take about the guideline about the public art. I think something Sabrina or maybe Jess said. It's going to go to the public art's going to have to go to the mayor and common council anyway. Is this a place where the guidelines don't need to be approved? I'm thinking in terms of like jumping ahead to because the acceptance is going to be approved ultimately by the common council and mayor anyway. Is this an example of that?
But I think I think we want to, as a council, give some input before they start making those individual decisions, right? So I think as I understood, a lot of what came up in the Parks and Rec conversation related to the dancer was sort of the shock of like, wait, we've committed to a long-term maintenance process, without any sort of council guidance as to when we want to commit to long-term maintenance, commitments and when we want to commit to this. So I would think that this would be an instance where the council should say, we are only, I'm making this up totally, but we are only willing to take on items of art that are orange and pink, that, only have maintenance costs of less than $10,000 a year and are aligned with, X, Y, and Z city objectives, right? So then when an individual gift comes in front of the mayor and the department, they already have some input from us as to how they should be evaluating whether it does or does not fit with the city's objectives. So that then when they then send us the request to approve, we're not saying, wait a minute, we don't agree with this, but after you've already spent all this time talking to donors and expended time and energy, right? We want them to have some idea beforehand about whether we're likely to approve it or not. I think, so that's why I feel like this is the kind of policy that, again, it doesn't change often. It's not subject to a need for, on the ground adjustments based on, feedback from local businesses or whatever, in the way that, for instance, the, outdoor dining guidelines would need to be. And we really want the council to have an input so that things aren't coming to us where they're essentially decisions made and we're just rubber stamping.
But, okay, it sounds like David has a comment on that. Looks like.
Yeah, I'm just curious then, and this ties into my question. This is 17A5 A3, which is develop and manage an arts and cultural plan. So that's one of the things that they're tasked with. They're tasked with creating goals and objectives, a management plan, and a marketing plan. Aren't those what you're talking about right there? And aren't those the things that are eventually going to be ultimately approved by the council once this plan is made? And then I asked the question of, are we going to put a time trigger for once this commission is in place to get that plan made. You know, because I've seen boards and commissions that have been tasked with things, and I've sat on committees, you know, in the course of my life where we've had a great plan to do something and it never got done because there was no time trigger. So I'm wondering if that needs to be put into this. But isn't that plan that you're talking about, so that we know what the plan is?
Well, the arts and cultural plan is required under the guidelines, right?
The state guidelines.
State guidelines.
Right. But that's my point, isn't it? And then we have to do that. It's going to reflect what we choose it to reflect for our city.
Well, the commission's going to develop it, right? Right.
And
So
I think that's different than a
add-
public art policy, right? The acceptance of public art would be could potentially be part of that, but it'd be a very small piece of it, right? The acceptance of public art, so 17A6B is a very discrete thing, right? The arts and cultural plan, I would assume, would be much larger than that.
Yes.
yeah, I agree. I think, yeah. I
All
think
of which ultimately the original plan could be approvable by the council, which allows for that. You know, that gives the guideline to the city to do the thing that it does, and we don't have to constantly be going to the council for this.
right. We need to balance that, right?
Why have a commission if everything's going to go to the council through a committee?
Exactly. So we have to
Why have a
balance it.
commission?
Yeah, we're not expecting that plan to go to council. I mean, that's really much more the work of the commission, and
Well-
that's required by the state.
And does it need to go to the council is my question initially,
No.
that we use some language in there or something.
No.
Well, and David, your point, you just made the point, if we'd have everything go to the council, what's the point of the commission, right?
Well, once you have the plan in place approved by them, then you don't, the mechanism is there.
Well, remember the plan's a quote unquote guiding document, meaning that this is something that could change from time to time. And so,
Well, we're talking about guidelines changing from time to time and all of this stuff. So, I don't know what the answer is, but
Jessica,
Well,
you might
right, and I
want to,
think
looks like you do.
I guess I'm having a challenge trying to understand from an operations process standpoint how this would look, right? Because it's sort of like I think the point is that the Arts Commission uses their professional art appreciation and their expertise to be able to identify what they think is of value for the city. And then they advise and make a recommendation to a committee, which then makes a motion to vote to accept the piece of art based on the information that we put forward, which often goes through Parks and Rec because there is a maintenance piece to it. And there is also a piece that it ends up in a public space. And then the Common Council has an opportunity to be able to learn about that piece and then vote as a full council. So I'm confused, I think, on what the process would be based on what we're talking about as far as sort of like, does that cut the Arts Commission out and just put it straight to council, or like the commission is making a recommendation based on their, professionalism and expertise as artists. And then the council is making the decision, I think, on more of the monetary sense or the long-term commitment of the actual piece. And so that in my mind is how it works. I'm confused a little bit on how, if it was to change, what that process would look like.
I think that's the process that we wrote, just as you described it. We get the
Right. So
recommendation.
I understand that piece, just in the sense of the conversation that's going on currently with having the council weigh in or work with us on the guideline piece. But I think I'm just a little confused on where we're headed with that.
Nora, do you want to make a comment on that? Is that what you're raising?
So I think that, and that's part of what I was trying to flag here is that we are using the word guidelines to describe two very different things, which I think is part of where the source of the confusion is. So I'm trying to come up with some language that might describe the difference, right? So for instance, I would suggest that 17A6B describes a policy, really not guidelines, regarding the acceptance of public art. And so I would define that as sort of like a stable, long-term policy for the city that provides broad parameters within which the council designates the mayor and the Arts Commission to then make determinations about individual pieces, right? So that would be a policy, and that would be a policy that would be approved by the council. And the intent there is that we have given guidance to the mayor and the commission as to what we would agree to when it comes in front of us, so that there is not surprise on either side if something comes up that is totally outside of the parameters of what the council considers appropriate. And then there is a plan, which, as David points to, is in 17A8A, item 1, the Arts and Cultural Plan. The plan is a working document for the activities of the commission. That would be appropriately developed by the commission and changed by them as necessary going forward, right? And that is a day-to-day kind of a thing that guides their annual work or their biannual work, or however they want to structure it. And that would appropriately be done by the commission, whose work it is. And then there are guidelines, which would be something that would be developed by a department and would be essentially administrative to cover, for instance, how, there's going to be a grant competition for the expenditure of the cultural district account funds. The guidelines explain how is that process going to be conducted, what applications have to be submitted, what do they have to comply with, et cetera, right? And these are all things that we already do as a city, but calling them all guidelines is confusing, right? Because they have different purposes, they're done by different bodies, they should be done differently. And for all the lawyers on the phone, right, this is the difference between sort of, an administrative, this is the difference between a regulation and an agency policy, right? So I think does that help, Jess? Does that make sense as to why, like what the differences might be, how they, and why some of them might be, why the policy might be subject for council approval and why it would not be then sort of taking over the commission's work, but would hopefully streamline it so that the commission actually doesn't, get through a process of accepting something only to find out that it's not appropriate from the council's perspective.
I think
going around in a circle.
I think it makes sense. I guess I don't know why. It makes sense. I guess where it's confusing to me is that we're diving in on the Arts and Cultural Committee, which I think is pretty positive in nature. And I get what you're doing. I don't mean that. We're digging in on it on this particular one, whereas I don't know if that's sort of the standard that we've been using in the past. And so I think we're digging into like a bigger, broader principle discussion and almost like standards discussion. And I'm just, so I think that's part of probably the bigger discussion here, why it's sort of from a operations staff person, just trying to understand where it's all sort of coming from and how it feeds into the ordinance, and how from our standpoint, we would make sure that we're satisfying everyone's expectations out of it.
Okay.
Well, I think you're exactly right. Like, this is the kind of thing that we are trying as a committee to get much more standard across all of our different ordinances and work. And so as these things are coming up, and like I said, we're about to have this exact same conversation in relation to the draft on the Affordable Housing Commission. So I think that's why this is coming up now, and why it is important for us to start as a committee coming to some clarity around this, because I do think it's something we should be much more consistent about going forward.
Yeah, I think we're splitting so many hairs right now. I think that if it, like, to mix metaphors, the horse is so dead. I don't even know which end I'm looking at. So let's think about where we are, because it was our intention to take a vote and send this to public hearing next month. And I feel like this is in really good shape, but for the idea of how we're going to handle the guidelines. And it feels as though there's a number of people who feel like there should be guidelines for the acceptance of public art that's approved by the Common Council, because that's policy, is I think what I'm hearing. And I'm hearing that the expenditures after, because they're much more streamlined and they're pretty, I want to say, purpose focused, there's less need to have those guidelines approved by Common Council. So is that what I'm hearing? And I think that comes down to one deletion, which would be in 17A8. We would just take out and approved by Common Council with regard to the guidelines to the business development and tourism. Because I don't think that I've heard anybody come up with a better word than guidelines as of yet. And if we come up with it, we can change it next week at our next meeting at public hearing.
I would only make one slight amendment to that, that I think they should be approved by the Arts Commission or whatever we're naming this now, Arts and Cultural Commission, not by the Common Council.
The expenditures?
Right. So they would be drafted by the Business Development and Tourism Department, and then they would be approved by the Arts and Cultural Commission.
Actually, I don't agree with that, because I think that the department is more knowledgeable on that type of thing. But let me go back, because Lisa, I actually think it's the opposite of what you just said.
Okay.
And that's just me. Yeah. On the public art, I'm convinced by some of the arguments made that, and Nora, I hear what you're saying, but I'm convinced that since the council has to review this and approve any sort of public art that's given, they don't, I mean, I know what you're saying. There can be guidelines. And I know what you're saying, Nora. I just don't want to put more work on everybody. I don't know that we need to have them approved by us, the guidelines, because we're going to have a right to look at this stuff and approve it anyway.
So you're thinking that we're going to make a decision with regard to each piece of art anyway. And so if you have guidelines, we might want to make exceptions to the guidelines because this piece of work is so important, or.
I mean, that's one argument, right? I mean, I hear the point that it sort of lays out what we are expecting to come up from the commission. Right. But I also think, is it another bureaucratic step? So that's what, look, I'm not.
I mean, I feel like, personally, for me, I feel like it'd be much more frustrating for the staff to go through the whole, 6 month to year process of, negotiating a donation and then have council say no. I mean, I feel like this is actually a problem we encounter a lot on the council, right? By the time something comes to us, it's the water so far under the bridge that we say, fine, we'll deal with it because we don't feel like, we don't want to undo a year's worth of staff work. So I feel like actually this is exactly the way to try to get some input in for the council such that we're not then frustrating staff down the line. Right? Because I mean, I feel like this policy is probably developed once and then we look at it. I mean, again, this is not something that's going to come, that's probably going to change a lot. So it's develop it once and then, in 4 or 5 years or in 10 years, it comes up again. I don't know. I don't know. That's sort of my.
So Josh and David and Ed, weigh
in.
Before,
Lisa, can I just finish my last thing?
Sorry, yeah.
This guy said a two-part, flipping around what you said.
Good. Yeah.
My feeling was on the other part, 8A, is anytime you're dealing with money, there's another reason that the guidelines should be approved. That was my thinking on 8A. That's why I'm flipped from what you said. But listen, I'm not going to live or die on this, and maybe we should put up whatever maybe we should be able, what Brian says that we can put in and that we can change without going back to public hearing again.
We can all think about it for a month, but Ed, Josh, or David, any thoughts? David,
I mean, my one thought, if we have it in one place, some guide, some plan, some regulation, however you want to word it, from the administrative standpoint. So this is, if we're looking at our enabling act, that our enabling act says, hey, commission, create a set of rules for acceptance of art, that in that area, in 5A3, wherever in that section, and they create something and then that gets approved and the council or the commission goes about its business and the city has its guideline, I guess, for what they would initially then bring to us as a piece of art that gets accepted. I mean, I don't know. I think we flogged the dead horse. So.
The horse is so dead.
Which is a piece of art, I have to say.
Indeed.
Consider being or rejecting a piece of art a policy statement. I think that you set up these commissions for a reason, and we rely on their expertise and their processes to administrate and to do what they're authorized to do. I don't know that the common council needs to be involved in that. Once we've created the commission, I think we need to trust that the commission, with the people that are appointed to it, are going to do what's consistent with their charge. And I don't know that adding another layer of oversight is really that important or that necessary.
Josh, do you have a feeling about it?
Not really at the moment. I mean, I think that trying to streamline is good. I think that making decisions like this that completely or try and alter staff process on the fly like this generally isn't the right way to do it. But I don't think that Nora's points aren't valid. I also literally have seen day turn to night in the middle of this entire discussion.
Totally, I agree with that. Well,
but no, I think that I think it's given me a lot to think about. I really don't have an opinion to sort of stream of conscious to right now.
Can I?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, well, just before, I want to move this forward. So I think I want to figure out a way we can move this forward. Brian, this is for you. With the one issue, obviously, we're struggling with this approval of the council on these two items. Which way would require us, if you can answer that, if we were going to have, if we go to public hearing with that and we take out that restriction, is that something that would have to go back to public hearing versus going out without it and putting it in?
So I think that if you go to public hearing and you insert something like that, that would be a significant change. I think if it's in there and it's discussed because the language is there and then you remove it, I think that's different. And I don't think that would require a second public hearing. Okay,
then I'd like to make a motion to move this forward with one other change, which is just a typo, basically, on 17A, 5A, 3A, the goals and objectives of the commission, including goals and success measures. It says for each cultural district. I think it should read success measures for cultural districts, plural. That way one can cover more, the goals and objectives could cover more than one district. That's just suggested that. And then I'd like to just move it forward as is to public hearing.
There's one other typographical error, which is 17A2 definition, a map of each cultural district.
Oh, no, you already said that one. Yeah.
Oh, okay, you got that. Okay. So I just wanted to remind everybody that that's it. So Mr. Livingston has moved it to go to public hearing. All in favor? David?
Aye, yeah. Sorry.
And Ed, yes. Okay. So we have agreed unanimously that it would go to public hearing, and then we'll deal with, everybody keep thinking about guidelines all night long. We'll come up with a new word for it. All right. So we're now going to move to the affordable housing ordinance, and we get to turn this over to Ms. Ayers, and Nora will be back on the post on this one too. So thank you guys for coming tonight. And Steve Kleppen, I'm sorry that you had to listen to a lot of dots and T's getting crossed, but thank you for waiting it out.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening to the Ordinance Committee. I just want to start off by saying that I am dealing with a personal issue with one of my parents, and I'm going to have to jump off. So please, I'm begging your forgiveness right now, but it is a dire issue. But Nora, as well as Darlene, will be able to finish the discussion. I will stay on as long as I possibly can, but if I jump off, it's because I have to jump off. So let's talk about affordable housing. The document before this committee tonight is a document that the ad hoc affordable housing and the ad hoc affordable housing committee has worked on for the last couple of months. And it is a working document. I believe in giving people their due, and Nora, as well as Corporation Counsel, have worked diligently to bring this document to you. The first thing I would like to highlight is that this document is a living one that has had several versions. So of course we have presented to you our best version, but we are aware that the committee will do additional work in making sure it fits the laws of the city around language and the scope. The city of Norwalk has an affordable housing crisis. Let me say that again. The city of Norwalk has an affordable housing crisis, and the committee is trying to address this by, one, acknowledging that there's a problem, which is that there's a limited amount of affordable housing in Norwalk. Two, we want to be good neighbors. We want to allow people to stay and reside in Norwalk and be able to thrive here. And we do understand that high rents are a burden against that. And three, the committee wishes to stabilize housing, which leads to a better overall quality of life. And it pushes, and we're trying to push towards home ownership so that we have residents that are really trying to make roots in Norwalk. And we do understand that affordable housing is a step towards that. Now, the word affordable housing is a large word, but in our document, we have clearly defined how we are using affordable housing and what are some keywords, and you can find that in the first part of the document. We also acknowledge that this is a national crisis and a national concern, but through the work of the ad hoc committee, we are striving to outline the perimeters of the Affordable Housing Account Committee. So this document is dealing with the establishment and empowering the mayor to form the Affordable Housing Account Committee that would manage funds that have been received and push or allow those funds to be used for people who are identified as needing the additional support. We do know that this is a beginning step, that there is some other work that the committee will be doing. We are also meeting tomorrow and receiving some presentations from city workers about what the city is doing to try to address affordable housing. So really, we need you to approve this document so that it can go to public hearing and then eventually go to the full council. Is there any additional questions? I know Nora is going to go section by section, and I believe you've all had the opportunity to peruse the document. No? Okay, Nora.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you,
So-
Nicole.
Oh, sorry, I forgot one thing. See, my mind is not with me right now. One thing that we left out of the document, and Darlene, I didn't forget you. And we did not want to leave it with us. We wanted to send it to you and give it to you to kind of do this work. How the document currently is set up is that the community members that are put on the committee, there is no language currently. It's just not there because we thought about it after we concluded the work of the document that would allow community members that sit on the committee to also have access to the funds. So those community members that sit on the committee have to be either an owner or a resident of affordable housing or low income housing. And we want to make sure that there's a provision in this document that those people would be able to access these funds and that they would not be excluded from accessing these funds. I think that was it.
Can I ask about?
Yes.
So that's a really interesting point, because one of the things I looked at this was the what we have in the other ordinances about conflicts. So we could still have provisions about conflicts dealing with council members or whatever, but what you want to make sure that people are not disincentivized to go on the council because they live in public housing, right?
Right. Yes, on the committee. And Darlene, do you want to speak to it because it was your genius?
No, I think you said it pretty well. I just think that, from my perspective and from folks that live in certain areas, if you're on committees, you're pretty much excluded from taking advantage of these opportunities. And that could go for employees as well. So I think that that's a concern. So how do we allow folks to take advantage of these opportunities. And I also said that I don't think that, we come up with this plan and the plan becomes, is live on such and such a date. I don't think that we should be the first ones to take advantage of that either, but I think we should absolutely have those who need assistance or want to take part in the opportunity. They should have that ability.
That's
Yeah,
so
I
true.
So just to jump in real quick on this, as it pertains to potential conflicts of interest, one of the things, Tom will remember this because he, unfortunately for himself, sat through a lot of these conversations with it when we revised the Code of Ethics. And this is why the Code of Ethics doesn't have every single situation and every single scenario. We can't legislate all of these things. We're going to have to talk about this more because there is this potential for conflict with these particular members. And so part of the things is going to be if we're going to circumvent this in that way and allow them to sit on these committees, they're going to have to be made well aware of the ability to get advisory opinions from the Board of Ethics about when to recuse themselves if they're allowed to sit in that situation on this committee or commission. We don't want them to violate the Code of Ethics either when they're trying to serve the city. So in that regard, we have to take a look at this issue more and make sure, number one, that it can work. And if it can work, that those people are made aware of the services that are available to them, specifically through the Board of Ethics, to help them navigate potential votes that might otherwise get them in trouble.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and Nora, you know just as well. I mean, this is a charter issue, right? It's not something we can necessarily just ignore. I'm not saying ignore, it's going to be a little tricky. Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me also, I'm sorry, no.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it seems to me, because we're dealing with, by definition, a limited resource, a limited sums of money from time to time, that I don't see how someone who is on the committee or commission on the committee can possibly have access or can vote can vote on any thing, because their vote is going to be in conflict with their own interest in perhaps receiving a grant or some money from this account. So I just don't see how that works.
So I'm not suggesting that anyone would be voting on something. I think we have to use our common sense and recuse ourselves. But if there's no way to do it, then there's no way to do it. I'm not suggesting that any person on a committee, subject themselves to that, or the city. I just, that was a question posed. I think there are people, as we've said, that in certain areas that might, be able to use this money, might want to be engaged. And so is this another thing that deters people, from that? I don't know. It was a question, and it would be great to get some perspective on it. I mean, I get it. That's not a position we want to put anybody in.
No, I'm worried about it too, Darlene. One of the things that we've been trying to do in some of the ordinances we've been looking at is put in this conflict of interest language to make it coherent with the ethics code. And in fact, we even did it in the cultural district. If anybody wants to look at that language, because we happen to have it handy, it's in 17A8C. So I do see Ed's and Tom's issues pretty clearly, and it would be very difficult to write that in such a way, really, to protect the people on the commission from accusations of self-dealing. It's pretty, I think it's tricky to draft, but
so, but part of what I want to raise here, that's just, well, it might be helpful to come back to this issue after we've gone through the ordinance, because I think, this ordinance creates a lot of space for very different possible uses of these funds. And so in some instances that could create a situation where, if there is a decision by or recommendation by the Affordable Housing Account Committee to allow individuals to apply for these funds, there could be a direct individual conflict, which they'd have to recuse themselves, and no question. I think but one of the other possible use of this fund is much more directed at sort of large scale projects. And in that instance, I think we would need to Brian's point, there would need to be input from the Ethics Commission, for instance. If you live in a housing development of 200 units and your housing development is applying for funds, there are exceptions in the codes of ethics for general benefits. And so anyway, I think we're putting the cart before the horse here. There's a lot of thinking that will have to go into the development of how this affordable housing account is being used before I think we can even really determine what possible conflicts might arise.
Exactly.
That's why
We've interrupted
Nora's
you.
right. They're all fact specific. All these situations are fact specific, and it's not just. I mean, they're like Nora said. There's a lot of different ways to spend the money, or how to implement those funds. But again, there is a potential for this, and so it is going to be an issue that has to be dealt with at some point.
Right, and particularly when you have city employees that aren't on committees that live in areas that might want to take, no matter where they live, might want to take advantage of that. So what does that mean? I work for the city, so I'm immediately excluded from the opportunity. I don't know.
And you'll see when we get further down to it with the makeup of the committee, we initially had the Norwalk Housing Authority or the Norwalk Redevelopment Agency on the committee.
Mhm.
And we decided as a committee to remove them because they are highly likely to be applicants and for these funds. And we decided that ultimately it was silly to have members of the committee who would have to recuse themselves on, every major
Right.
application decision. That was just not going to be productive. So this is just, I think this is going to be an ongoing situation that's going to have to be thought through as this committee kind of develops over the next few years.
Well, Nora,
And we
why don't you I feel like we hijacked you on this and took the we took the focus away. So do you want to start at the beginning and we'll, kind of go?
Yeah, I think right. I think these issues will be a little clearer if we start in the beginning and go through. And again, I think the point that Nikki made that's important here. This is ultimately this is a relatively narrow ordinance. This is not intended to sort of solve affordable housing in Norwalk. This is very specifically really to deal with a particular source of funding, which Steve Kleppen so graciously is here in relation to, which is under the Norwalk Workforce Housing Regulations in the zoning regs. There is actually specific funding for affordable housing that developers are required to pay in certain instances. And that's what sort of triggered the goal to have a revolving account dedicated only to affordable housing that would sort of hold these funds and allow us to kind of gather them and do something substantial with them. So that was sort of the triggering event here. And, as Nikki said, we start with definitions. We have developed a definition for what affordable housing is that aligns with definitions we found elsewhere in the state, that aligns with grant programs and things that we might be seeking. Because again, one of the conversations we had around this was that this could potentially be a source for sort of last mile funds. So the city is applying for a grant, we need a matching 10%, or we need a matching, X amount. And this would be, potentially a way to provide those kind of funds to allow the city to seek other grant opportunities. We then have a preamble here that I think, we really tried to recognize, as Nikki said, what really are the goals of providing affordable housing for Norwalk, the importance of acknowledging the history of it, the importance of not acknowledging the racial component, the discrimination component, but also the future looking component, the impact that it has on the city's sustainability and our resilience to climate change, acknowledging the importance of both renting and home ownership, and really trying to seek to achieve both of those goals for the city. We then established the Affordable Housing Account Fund, which, if you look at this sort of provision here, and we went back and forth on this at great length, but the committee decided that really this account is for the hard costs of building more housing, or maintaining and repairing housing. But this is not for soft funds. This is not for sort of for studies or plans or anything else. This really is a goal of getting more units in the city. And so we limited it to words or purposes that kind of are geared towards, having more units. And then we established the committee in 1-2, and it's a 7-member committee. As I said, we spent a lot of time going back and forth about who to appoint, in part with this goal of sort of avoiding conflicts as much as possible, but also getting valuable staff input. And so it is 2 council members, a staff or an employee or a commissioner from planning and zoning, and a staff employee from the Department of Health and Human Services, and then 3 Norwalk residents, at least one of whom owns an affordable housing and at least one of whom rents affordable housing. And then, in the duties and powers, and this gets back to the guidelines. Like I said, that's why I was sort of talking about this so much, because this is coming right back up here. So we have the committee reviewing, revising, and adopting affordable housing account expenditure guidelines that are prepared by planning and zoning. And then reviewing applications for expenditures of fund that are in accordance with those guidelines. And then preparing and presenting an annual written report to the council regarding the balance on the affordable housing account and what the expenditures that were made and the status of each project that was funded. 1-3.
Nora, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
Nora,
Yep.
sorry, I have some other questions, but I just want, because you said
Yeah.
this. Who approves those? You said they review it, and I just from what you just said that minute.
So they
you're gonna
review, revise, and adopt. So the committee is adopting the affordable housing account expenditure guidelines. But to our
No,
conversation,
you got the guidelines, but I'm sorry, I should do this
No.
later. I mean, guidelines, but they review and adopt the guidelines, and then they give a report on it. But who actually approves the grants?
oh, that's further down. That's in
Okay, sorry. Okay.
that's in 1.4. But yes, but to your point, the committee approves the grants and then they go to the council for a vote. But to the conversation we were having earlier, should these expenditure guidelines also go to the council for approval or for a vote? And I think an open question. So then in 1.3 is the sources of funding. As I mentioned, there is a potential source already in the Norwalk zoning regulations. We also allow for the city to put additional funding in. The 1.4 is expenditures. So again, the Director of Planning and Zoning is preparing guidelines and an application process. The guidelines are subject to a public comment period, and then are approved by the Affordable Housing Committee. Once those guidelines are in place, then applications come in. The Affordable Housing Committee again reviews the applications, makes their selections, and then forwards them to the Common Council. And so again, to the conversation we were having earlier, in this case, we did specify that they go to finance and claims and then to the Common Council. And that's it. That's pretty much the process laid out here.
Josh, it looks like you have a question, then Mr. Livingston.
Yeah, I'll keep it short here. First of all, Nora, this is looking really great. Let's just start there. And Nicole, and I mean, this is looking like it is definitely, great looking shape. Question about funding source, and Steve, I may need your assist on this one. If I remember correctly, there are previous to the zoning regs rewrite that we're talking about now, the proposed draft, this funding source had already existed. Or Steve, or is this the Lou Schulman idea?
No, so we already have, there's already several $100,000 in an account. It's a protected, dedicated account that we receive funds from on current applications. We've been doing so for the last 2 to 3 years. And the new regulations, or draft regulations, actually have some additional sources they're trying to pull in for different projects that haven't been looked at in the past as part of this, but do have an impact on housing. So we're trying to make it a little more comprehensive.
So I guess my question is, because I know that, I mean, I'm calling it the Lou Schulman idea. I realize there's an actual name for it, but the other sources of funding that are going to be essentially paid by developers and are part and parcel with this source, can they be pooled in one place, or is there a reason they need to be in discrete places?
No,
'Cause
so
this to me is one account that we're talking about that already exists, even though there may be more than one account that's established as part of the new draft regulations.
So the funds that are part of the workforce housing regulations statutorily have to go for specific uses, which I think are captured correctly in the ordinance.
Yeah.
And they're really, when we put the workforce housing regulations, the idea was that, they have to give us 10% of the units for the multifamily developments at
Right.
the income levels established in the regulations. But we also recognize that there's a need for additional housing at different income levels. So that's where we targeted the less than the 60% SMI. But
Right.
we also talked about, this goes back a while, that there might be other sources of revenue that come in that could work in conjunction with these funds that we could leverage together. Like the redevelopment agency used to have a capital request of, I believe it wasn't a lot, it was like $50,000 annually for affordable housing. And they used to do it towards some rehab projects in different areas, particularly in South Norwalk. So we talked like maybe it'd be a good idea to pool these funds so it gives more leverage for different projects going down the road.
And you can see that's where I'm heading. And I'm wondering if there are other viable sources that can be pooled. And I'd rather deal with this now while we're writing the ordinance than later having to amend the ordinance to include other accessible funding sources. I'm just wondering if there are other ones that exist that we need to be thinking about that should be contemplated as part of this ordinance.
It's definitely possible that you could receive grant money to do something. Leveraging funds is pretty common with these kind of projects, as well as anything like an open space purchase. Anything the city can pool plus what the funding source pools always goes a long way. So I as far as I'm concerned, it's fine. I think the only thing you'd have to be cognizant of is if you're mixing the funds, making sure that the funds go to the appropriate location and don't do anything
Absolutely.
that conflicts with the statutory language.
Of course.
Okay, great. Mr.
Thank
Livingston?
you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a number of questions, and I'll try and just do the main ones right now. So just want to understand something. So when you talked about the qualified expenditures, do you anticipate the language covering like, I don't know if closing costs would be covered by this when you took out the administering? How do you see that?
Closing costs in what regard?
Well, if we're going to, I don't know how the fund works. If we're going to provide, we're going to give them a grant of money. If they have to, I'm talking about well, I use the word administrative, you took it out. So I'm just thinking, let me rephrase it. Are there any other costs that somebody might incur in receiving a grant or getting these funds that we want to cover? I assume you've already thought about this, but I want to think it through.
Yeah, so we talked about this at great length, and the committee, the consensus of the committee was that this is not intended to be, for instance, funds to help individuals purchase a home, right? There are lots of other programs that do that. This is really intended for the hard costs of construction of new units or of rehabilitation of units such that they remain livable and therefore remain in the affordable housing pool. So the committee we didn't want this to duplicate sort of other existing programs. We weren't interested in this being like a sort of a social services kind of program. This really was intended more for construction kinds of, or at least that was the goal as the committee sort of set it out.
Does that include architecture and engineering? Those aren't listed, but I don't know, would you consider those to be in those phrases, or are there more phrases to be added?
I don't know if anyone brought up architecture or engineering. I would sort of think that would go potentially into the constructing of, but if,
Steve, do
I
you
mean,
need? to
again, I think
separate
that would be
those?
within line of with the committee's sort of goals, if those are phrases that, and again, I mean, I defer to Nikki and Darlene as well, but,
Steve, how
I
does,
think that would be in line with the goals that people had laid out.
Yeah, my experience in the past, kind of administering one of these is that those costs were viable costs because, for example, say the housing authority had a project they were interested in, but you know, the architectural fees were several $100,000 and, you know, they could get costs for the construction through other venues or other programs, but they couldn't needed the funds to handle that piece of it. They would request a drawdown of funds for that purpose to handle the architecture, engineering, or whatever attorney fees that were associated with that particular phase.
could we add those just to make it clear?
Yeah, I think
I'm not interested in that. I think that that's not the best use of money because we often do this. If we're really talking about providing housing for people who are struggling, who profits from that? So you're saying a developer or their architect would be able to take 50,000, 100,000, or whatever that cost is? Who benefits? And
Darlene, wait,
at the end, you're building housing for someone to benefit. I think we go that way too much. And I think we think down on people who really need assistance, who live in South Norwalk. And it's not an architect, or it's not, we're talking about these things like we've got land and we're going to do all those things. I even have an issue with us talking about funding the housing authority. The housing authority is a federally funded organization, and we give a lot of money for them to maintain their facility. Where's the government in this? We continue to do this. There's a population of people who are not in housing, who can't afford the market rate rents, but they're stuck right there in the middle. And I think we have to keep our eyes on that. When we talk about affordable, it's always workforce housing, which means you're making well over what most frontline folks are making. And this sounds just like another program that's not for folks who really need it. When we talk about doing those things, that's just important.
So Darlene, I'd raised the question because I just want to make sure that everybody who participates in the program gets all their costs covered. I hear your point, but that's why I raised it, because I want to make sure that there's nothing that people get stuck with. Right.
I get that point. Yeah, that's.
So I don't know, I'll defer on that. I just want to go through these things.
Yeah, I interrupted you. So continue, Tom, please.
Excuse me, Tom, before you go through, I just want to caution this August body about we're using certain terminology, workforce, low income. We need to understand that the majority of the citizens that we are elected to serve, a lot of them are struggling with being able to be sustainable and thriving. So however you write it and when you write it, I'm not going to say it's South Norwalk, because I know tons of people throughout our city who are struggling to maintain housing. I'm not trying to take us back to the budget, but several of you gave public comment during the budget cycle that your neighbors were struggling to stay in their homes. So I don't want us to think that it's only South Norwalk. Don't get me, there's people there too. But throughout our city, there are people who need this assistance, and that, as Darlene is saying, are falling in the gaps. So when you're adding on all these things, let's just make sure, and Tom, I hear your point, I think it's a strong point, but let's just make sure that we are really helping and not hindering people. That's it.
Okay. Just to move on, just because I know time's moving on. So I had some questions about the committee structure, and so typically, and I'm not saying we have to do this, but just when you thought through the structure of the committee, I see you don't have mayoral appointment and council approval, right? Is that intentional?
We do, well, the mayor appoints, you're asking why we don't then have council approval?
Yeah, like we do on other committees. Is that intentional?
Yeah, I don't think that was intentional. I think, I mean, I don't know if anyone else correct me, but Brian
unless it's because we have two council members on it. And so I don't know, Brian, that's a good
Well, we
question
have
that
to-
I don't recall us really discussing one way or the other.
I sat through a couple of those meetings, Tom, and for the life of me, I cannot remember that question being asked. I know that we talked a lot about how the committee was going to be put together. But in terms of mayoral appointments, I don't believe that came up. That's certainly something we could talk about, though.
Okay, again, I have a bunch, so I don't want to take everybody's time here.
Yeah,
Just-
but I think we want to be as consistent as possible unless there was some reason not to. So I think that is probably just an oversight that needs to get added.
Okay, how did you come up with 2 council members versus 1 council member and let's say another member of the community? Again, this is a little different than we normally do. That's why I asked the question. Doesn't mean it's right the way we normally do it. I'm just saying.
Hey,
I
was
think
that
that-
something that was brought up? We had a
Yeah.
little conversation over that, right?
Yes, at our last meeting, again, you're seeing the last version. It's not the first version. So at our last meeting, we wanted to make sure that the voices of the people who would be directly affected was supported. And so we needed to make a committee and have the dynamics of the committee there to support the people who, those resident citizens that would be on the thing. And so we had to increase it, and we were trying to be creative in the way of increasing the number of committees, and we landed on 2 common council members. Again, that was our last, this is the last version. The best way to see is to watch the video, but we landed there. That's not where we started. That's where we landed.
Gotcha. So it seems
And
to
I-
me. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and I do think that to the conversation Nikki and Darlene were having a minute ago, I do think part of it was this sense of making sure that more than one neighborhood was represented by the council members. I mean, it doesn't specifically say that they can't both be from the same district. I suppose we could add that, but I think that was certainly the sense of the committee, was to make sure that there was geographical diversity of representation.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also think that it just seems to me that if somebody's a council appointment, they shouldn't stay on the committee once they're no longer on the council. I'm talking about the council members. Anyway, just keep going. We can talk about all these later. The approval you talked about, Nora, I think we got to go through the approval process. That wasn't clear to me how it's approving, and and what that process is. But you mentioned that. Just another quick question, and this is a technical question, maybe 1.3C. It says all funds deposited in the affordable housing account are subject to deed restrictions. I take it that means that any money that's expended for a project, that project is subject to a deed restriction. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not the
And-
funds, right? Yeah.
Right, and Steve can talk to this more, but that is currently a requirement of the workforce housing regulations, that any project that received these funds be subject to those restrictions. And so we just wanted to make sure that it carries through, because there is the potential that there can be funds in this affordable housing account that come from other sources. Again, the city could put money in, there could be grant money. And so it would become, I think, administratively very complex to try to parse out the different sources of funds then out in which were subject to deed restrictions, et cetera. So we wanted clarity that just all of them would be across the board. That also, I think, really speaks to the concerns of a lot of folks in general in the community about affordable housing rolling out of affordability at a certain point. And so this would make sure that funds that are projects that receive these funds remain affordable.
Okay, so
That
makes
said,
sense.
Darlene, I know, has raised concerns about those restrictions as they relate to ownership options, because when they are deed restricted and yet owned, then that limits the ability of the homeowner to sort of develop, potentially to develop the wealth, the family wealth from it. That is one of the goals of home ownership. So it's a complex issue that I think we're alert to the complications of and may need to be discussed further.
Thank
Okay.
you, Nora, for raising that.
Yeah. All right. I should let other people go. I'm sorry. I come back to me or not.
Ed, do you have some things that you'd like to raise? Some questions?
Yeah. just a couple of points. I think those deed restrictions in those in other types of projects that involve affordable housing, they tend to wane over time, so that the idea is not to be able to sell the thing for a profit, soon, but because there's ownership involved over time and over a significant period of time, I guess, in most cases, then those restrictions are effectively diminished.
So just to clarify, the workforce housing regulations as currently written require these to be restricted in perpetuity. These are not ones that wane over time.
Right. I'm referring to other ones where you do have that. So in other words, where you do have, because there's ownership, and you don't want to deprive owners of that type of that type of acquiring an asset over time, that means something, that's meaningful. In New York City, for instance, they do, or they used to do a lot of that in the 80s, where basically over time the restrictions basically went away to such an extent that you could actually sell your property for something closer to market value than you could for the first 10 or 15 or 20 years. But that's a separate issue. My question is, can someone give me examples of how the types of grants or uses or disbursements that would be made from this account? In other words, because I heard that construction is one of them, but architecture, which is necessarily a component of construction on occasion, would not be. And I guess the impression I got from that is that what people are talking about is largely grants to individual homeowners to either purchase or to do something with their property. What types of uses are we envisioning with this?
So, and Nikki may want to jump in on this. There was a lot of debate about this in the committee. And I think that the ordinance is written quite broadly to allow for a lot of discretion within the committee to make decisions about that once this is implemented. Because I think there are different perspectives on different committee members. I think there are certainly committee members who would like to see this end up being something that is directed more towards individuals. I think other committee members felt that from a cost or sort of from an efficiency basis, this was better used as sort of last mileage funding for, grant applications for larger projects, multi-unit projects. So the thing the committee was on consensus on was the goal of this being used again for hard costs for the creation of more units, or the sort of allowing existing units to remain livable, or to be rehabbed to a state of livability such that there are more units in total. That was the sort of consensus goal. But how they will actually be expended, I think remains a little bit of an open question.
Great. Steve, it seems like you've got your hand up, unless Ed needs to follow up on his question. Or Steve, go ahead.
No, thank you. That answered the question.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, just in my mind, I think the home ownership would be very difficult with this, because you can't control somebody's income at that point. That they could increase their revenue intake could increase over time, and then they would perhaps be beyond the thresholds established within the ordinance. I think this is, in my mind, this works on managed properties where somebody is administering the property, whether it's a housing authority or some other nonprofit organization that provides affordable housing. And this assists them with providing that affordable housing to individuals of the lower end of the spectrum, below that 60% SMI limit. Because I think trying to give it out as a homeowner grant, and then having that deed restriction on, you don't really know. You have to somehow track that home ownership over time and whose income is in there, I think that would be, from an administrative standpoint, would be really difficult.
So then, we've written out or administrating the provision of, we've crossed that out apparently in this language, in this draft. Wouldn't that then be an important language to leave into the ordinance, leave in the ordinance? Since you're talking about the administration of affordable housing.
Well, so a couple of things first, that is actually why we took administering out. The committee again felt very strongly that they didn't want these funds to kind of get dispersed into essentially being management fees or, management costs for existing housing. They really wanted to be used for new units or to salvage units so that they remain. So I think the administering was taken out deliberately to prevent that. To Steve's point, I think the committee recognizes the challenges of doing affordable home ownership, but it is very important to a lot of members of the committee. I think for a lot of very strong policy reasons that I think this body is very aware of. And I think that part of our hope is that by having a committee that is charged with this, it creates space for creativity, creates space for folks who have expertise in this area to help come in and potentially design or develop something or figure out, lessons we can learn from other places. Again, I think the goal is to leave it open, and the ordinance very clearly allows for this money to be used for rental properties or home ownership properties, but that's part of why we wanted that language in there, is that potentially this committee comes up with a way of administering it, or comes up with a grant that they can participate in, or an organization they can partner with. I think, we recognize the difficulties there, but I think people on the committee felt very strongly about sort of keeping that possibility open in hopes that there are ways of doing so effectively. And I think, as this committee discusses it, if the deed restriction is in the ordinance is in the regulation, and the money comes from the regulation. And so I do think we have limits there, but that's potentially something this committee should discuss with Steve if there is something we want to do there on that point or not. I think there's also people who feel very strongly that having the deed restriction in perpetuity is a value add, because we don't want to be investing city money in something that in 20 years is no longer affordable. So I think we're very open. I think that's a very open point for discussion.
So I was thinking at this point, maybe the thing to do is for Tom and me to sit down perhaps with you, Nora, and Nicole, and kind of go through and make this, as you guys know, that there's sort of like a template that we use for a lot of our ordinances. For instance, definitions usually come after the purposes, blah, blah, blah. So we could come down and put it a little bit more in the Norwalk code of standard practice. And then if there's some other comments that people have that they might want to share, please let us know, share with Nora, and we can incorporate those into the next draft. And hopefully we'll have a good draft for the next meeting that we can maybe be able to take forward to hearing. Any other thoughts before we?
Yeah, I just to put a sort of a dot on that last point. It seems that what I'm hearing is at odds with what Steve thinks is the more appropriate, what's doable, or basically what it seems that the two versions of what this is are almost incompatible. So that, I think that taking out the word administering makes this decidedly less flexible than it would be with that language in there. And I think that there's a potential for this to become sort of, to be, hand-to-hand combat, combat with respect to affordable housing, as opposed to approaching it more from a global or administrative point of view, where we're having the greatest impact with the fewest dollars. So I'm just concerned about those two views of what this ordinance should be or can be.
Yeah, Steve, please.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think I have no problem taking, I guess I would separate. What I had mentioned earlier was if, like, to me, the soft costs of it, such as architectural fees, engineering fees, I would not categorize that as administrating. I think administrating to me is more maybe what Nora was saying about managing the accounts and the processing of the accounts. I think you could add a word in instead of administrating in for like developing or something like that, which might encompass those kind of fees or so those kind of costs, like the architectural engineering soft costs.
Well, let's see if we pull together a second draft and go through that, if we can reconcile some of those thoughts in the draft.
So I'll just share this with you, as you brought up something about, and I heard you mention, Steve, about the, and I think I've said this before, about the deed restriction in perpetuity. Is that what you said? One of you said?
That's
that?
what I said. Yeah.
That's what you said, right? So I live in one of those developments for the past 30 years, and I've shared this with you all, and I don't have any problem saying that because I've said it before, and it's a trap. And so as a city, we need to really be thinking differently about how we are going to move forward with providing housing, affordable housing, low income housing for people. And I hear you, Ed, but it just sounds to me like the same old way that we've done business before. And we really need to do it differently if we're truly interested and committed to this issue. I'm in a place where I've been over 30 years, and I'm very limited by the constructs of the deed restriction that the city allowed to pass over 30 years ago, which means I can only make 10%, not even 10% above what I made, what I spent on my place. And that's not helping people. And so when we really think about this, we really have to think, how are we really moving people forward and helping families? And I don't think that this conversation right now is doing it. I think we're working on it, but we've got a long way to go.
I'd have to follow up on that. Didn't I hear that you guys want to have permanent deed restrictions?
I think to some degree, I think there's something a little different that happens when you say that with deed restrictions, because it can work for you. Who benefits from a deed restriction? Particularly if you're talking, well, this was a home ownership program, so I own my home, but I don't have any real assets because of deed restrictions. And the same thing happened with Columbus Court. So when we talk about this, we really need to be thinking a little differently about some of these things. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, I was just a little confused because Nora, I thought you said this would be permanent deed restrictions. Yeah.
It would, and this is, I mean, so this is, we discussed this in the committee some, and I think this is an ongoing issue we need to grapple with. So the zoning regulation that is currently providing the bulk of these funds requires deed restriction in perpetuity for projects receiving those funds. And so that is already required for these funds. We added it into the ordinance because for administrative consistency, because we couldn't see any way that the account could basically have some portion of the funds that come from the zoning regulations be deed restricted, but then if there are funds coming in from other sources like the city not being subject to that, in essence, you end up needing to have two separate accounts, which sort of defeats the whole point of having a pooled approach here. But I think it's tricky because I very much hear Darlene's point, right? Deed restrictions do not serve the purpose of building equity in affordable home ownership programs. However, I think deed restrictions in perpetuity are highly desirable for rentals, because otherwise you have developers who agree to a deed restriction for 10 years, and at 10 years in one day, they start trying to figure out how to evict their affordable tenants, right? And so that's one of the conflicts in the whole sort of affordable housing space here. And so I think very open to thoughts and ideas if there's some better way we could handle the deed restriction issue here, given the existing zoning regulations, and or Steve, if the zoning regulations are being changed in relation in the new zoning rewrite in general, that certainly is an issue we should visit before we sort of put it in the ordinance. I think right now it does reference, as amended. But I also, like I said, I think part of, the formation of the committee here was to sort of have a space for some of these really complex policy conversations to potentially be worked out. And so we don't, a long way to say that, Tom, you're completely correct. And I think it is a major issue that we have flagged in the committee that we don't currently have a clean solution for, given the existing zoning regulations, but are open to other thoughts about that as this committee works through it.
Good. Well, let's take this, let's take like one more draft, maybe with Tom, you and me meeting for a quick, let's consolidate it like we were talking about before, kind of in the NORA code structure, and then bring it back to the committee next month with some new ideas. That'd be great. That's all I have on the agenda. Does anybody have any new business they'd like to raise other than an adjournment vote? Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
All right. Thanks all.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Great meeting with only 2 items on your agenda.
Always like this.
Always
Always like
I'm
this.
sorry. This will be the last one for the year. Bye. Have a good